Hello everyone. Since the dawn of the 20th century, species conservation practices have become increasingly interventionistic, labor-intensive and costly. Caring for critically endangered species required pioneering and messy work, which often involved novel and unlikely technologies. In this presentation, I discuss a few examples of technologies of care which I encountered in my research on the history of reintroducing endangered species. I will talk about hand puppets for raising chicks, dart guns used for immobilization and administration of drugs. These have become ubiquitous in the conservation of many species, but I also discuss, for example, feeding hoppers for kakapos, which are more recent and particular for these species. These were small technological fixes for practical problems, they were like little breakthroughs. I explore how and why such technologies have been developed and used in species conservation. I show that in the short run, these technologies might be risky, traumatic, deceiving, infuriating, can actually cause also the death of animals. However, humans are seeking the well-being of the animals in the long run. And technologies are meant to help, usually meant to erase the human and to replace human handling with something thought as being more neutral and less harmful. One technology of care widely used in conservation of birds is decoys. Decoys are life-size models of a creature or part of a creature meant to induce animals to believe and act in certain ways. Decoys are deceptions. They have been used for centuries in game hunting, especially wildfowl decoys. More recently, they have been repurposed from devices meant to kill animals to devices meant to save animals. Decoys and hand puppets have been used especially in bird conservation for feeding hand-reared chicks. The California condor is a notorious case in conservation. A captive breeding program began in 1980 when an estimate of only 22 California condors were left in the world. Conservationists needed to come up with ideas to make more condors, but they typically laid only one egg at a time, so boosting the numbers would have been really slow. To get around it, they induced the birds to double clutch. They removed one egg and fostered it, allowing the parents to lay another egg. So that meant double production. Since the 1940s, with the studies of Konrad Lorenz, it was known that hand-reared birds imprint on humans. Thus, human care hinders their abilities to identify with their own species and especially to mate with their own kind. So to avoid imprinting and socially impairing the birds, condor hand puppets were used to raise the chicks. Puppets in the shape of adult condors fed the hatchlings until they fledged. But while double clutching worked well and the chicks survived, the long-term effects of such technologies remained unknown. How successful would puppet-reared chicks be in the wild? Was there any difference between them and the parent-reared chicks? This care for the species and care for the behavioral integrity of chicks, was it really working? Research seemed to show that puppet parents raised troubled condors. In 1992, when puppet-reared condors were first released, many died and nearly 20% had to be recaptured for behavioral problems. Later, in 1996, when parent-raised condors started to be released, mortality rates were quite similar, but recapture rates were much lower. So puppet-raised condors had a behavioral problem. Conservationists figured out that initially puppeteers were too gentle with the chicks. When they were released, researcher Amy Ott showed these birds did not integrate well into the condor community, and they still showed an unhealthy curiosity about humans. The puppeteers became more aggressive, and the chicks were also placed into what was called a mentoring program with adult condors in an aviary. Nobody deluded themselves that this was even coming close to the real thing. However, the increase in condor numbers were promising and captive breeding went on. Puppets have been widely used in captive breeding or rehabilitation of birds. So this technology of care might solve some problems, but it is not a universal solution. It is necessary that researchers recognize the limits, the dangers, and the compromises of care practices and look into the effects of such technologies of care and try to understand them. For handling wildlife that was kept in captive breeding facilities, such as large mammals, like dangerous big cats, for example, or edgy Przewalski's horses or antelopes, one of the problems faced by keepers and conservationists was how to capture and handle these animals. How to treat injuries, for example, or how to administer drugs that were meant to treat parasites or other ailments. How to manage to insert microchips or transmitters. These were seen as essential in caring for the animals, but how to achieve these without chasing the animals to exhaustion, without habituating them too much to being handled, without stressing them. One of the solutions found was the dart gun or the tranquilizer gun, which operates like at one end there is a gun that can be fired from afar, and at the other end there is a needle and a syringe. It's like a ballistic, like a flying syringe that delivers a drug to the animal. But this is very complicated to do, so you have to aim very precisely, and you have to aim at the part of the body of the animal, like for example with the horse you have to aim at a part of the horse that is muscled, and so the horse will fall in a certain way that avoids injury. You shoot the horse in the shoulder or in the rump, and then the horse falls. So being tranquilized is quite a stressful and a risky operation for the animal, and it is also sort of stressful for the animals around. But in the long term, this sort of capture and treatment is seen as beneficial for the animals. And why this darting is a technology of care. It is a technology of care also understood in the sort of larger picture of recovery of these animals. For example, for rewilding, for transportation. If you want to transport the animals from one place to the other, you have to transport them in crates. And how to put the animals in a crate requires sometimes the tranquilization of the animal. Perhaps this example of tranquilization tech comes close to the ideas that Tom Van Doren and Juno Salazar Pareñas have explored in their work, that care for wildlife in captive breeding environments can be violent. The idea that, in the words of Maria Puig de la Pelacasa, care is grounded in the inescapable troubles of interdependent existences and can offer no guarantee of a smooth, harmonious world. Then, another technology of care I want to talk about is the supplementary feeding station used in the conservation of kakapo. The station is made in such a way that it only opens for a certain bird and it weighs the bird as it is feeding. The bird is equipped with an individual transmitter which signals whether it is the right bird, and while it hops onto the scales, the feeder opens or not. So the smart hoppers have mechanical arms plugged into the data logger that is fed from the transmitter. The arm locks the lid shut unless a kakapo wearing the right transmitter comes along. This is quite frustrating for the birds who try to feed on hoppers which are not meant for them. So conservationists are rationing the supplementary feed for each bird in an attempt to maintain them at optimal weight. So to feed them, but not too much. So why is this necessary? What lies behind such practices? The kakapos, the world's fattest parrots, are nocturnal and flightless. There are very few in the world at present, just over 200. A very intensive conservation program began in 1995. However, their recovery went very slow because much was not known and the bird's breeding is very peculiar. Kakapos only breed in years when the rimu trees are fruiting, that is every 4 years. They have to be of a certain weight to breed. So for a while it seemed that supplementary feed was the solution. The kakapos were well fed and this seemed to have improved maternal condition. It increased breeding frequency. Yet another really peculiar problem appeared. The chicks produced were mostly males. With painstaking research in the early 2000s, it was demonstrated that too much food can influence the sex ratio of offspring, producing a male bias. The male bias is not good in a small population where one wants many breeding females. So it seemed that breeding females must be kept under a certain weight in order to produce female chicks. And this is why feeding is good only in certain quantities. And here is where the smart hoppers come in, and feeding is associated with weight. Kakapo conservation has been extremely labor intensive, and where the kakapos are living, it's a very rough terrain, and so for humans to chase the parrots and to catch them and weigh them every time and then feed them accordingly would have been not only very labor intensive but also very stressful for the birds and very, very complicated. So this sort of technology of care where you sort of do all of that remotely, even though it frustrates probably the birds, it sort of proves to be a solution to this particular problem. However, it's still unknown what does this do for the feeding habits of the birds, right? And whether the birds that are not fed anymore would be able to breed, and how and what the long-term effects of such technology are. If one looks at the history of species conservation, at practices of conservation, one can see a lot of technology, and especially in the case of critically endangered species, which are also very charismatic, like the kakapo or the horse, one can see a lot of technological development. A common feature of these technologies of wildlife care is that they, or at least their underpinning principles, were originally developed for other purposes, for hunting or for military uses like telemetry, or in the medical or veterinary fields. They were later adopted and adapted by the conservation community. And one idea in the current conservation debates is to start developing more custom-made technology, like the kakapo hoppers are, based on previous failures and learning processes. And these new technologies would be suited for particular animals and for particular needs. What these technologies have in common is that they mediate human intervention while at the same time trying to erase or to hide the human in the relationship. So one of the biggest problems that was recognized by conservation was that sort of human handling of wildlife, which proved detrimental in every way. So a thoughtful care of wildlife involved letting the animals be, separating the human out, but still intervening. So this erasure is actually not an erasure of the human, but erasing as much as possible, hiding as much as possible.